Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Wrap. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, joined today by Chris Hutton. Let's get into the news. And the first one is, and this is, I think, one of the most shocking, depressing stories I've read about South Africa's education system ever, and that's a high bar to cross. The Oppenheimer Memorial Trust Education Research Report has looked into the quality of teachers across South Africa and has found that only 55% of South African teachers performed at the same level as grade 4 children internationally. Researchers found huge gaps, they said, in early childhood development. And in the report, they said our country cannot afford to lose yet another generation of learners by not giving them key capabilities they need to succeed at higher levels of education. 80% of grade 6 mathematics learners were taught by teachers with mathematics subject knowledge below the grade 6 level. And only 55% of teachers met the intermediate benchmark of progress in the International Reading Literacy Study, which 82% of all grade 4 learners achieved internationally. So basically, the people teaching South Africa's children, in many cases, are simply not equipped to be able to do the job. Chris, this seems like one of those things that is going to really cripple the country for years to come if we don't start sorting it out right now. We've already have so many problems with unemployment, and when you're producing people into the marketplace, into the labor market, who just don't have the skills to take on modern work, I think we're really setting ourselves up for a lot of suffering and a lot of poverty. What do you make of the story? What should government be doing to turn this around?
Absolutely. You get the regular talk of the fourth industrial revolution. It's and bullet trains, and you talk about those things. Meanwhile, your pupils can't read or write adequately, and those who are tasked with teaching them, and as the study indicates, are also encountering their own challenges. And this sort of puts pay to the idea of, you spend on these items, you've got to developmental states, and everything will be solved. Education is one of the biggest items in the budget every year, but we're not seeing it in terms of quality outcomes for South Africans. We talk about addressing the legacy of apartheid. You don't do that by sending out young Black South Africans, who are the majority in the country, and not equipping them adequately to work either here or in a global marketplace. And as South Africa is part of the global economy, they have to compete in a global environment as well. And you can't just expect them to continue working in sort of low wage, low skill place sort of industries like just agriculture and manufacturing. If you really want to have sort of benefication of the economy, produce more complex goods, be innovators in technology, create jobs, unlock capital investment, you need to ensure that the building blocks of good education are there. In terms of what the government can and should be doing, you have to look at the influence of the unions in the public sphere, in the public schools. You also have to look at the spending. You talk about massive spending, but to what is it going? Is it going towards administration, bureaucracy? Is it going to reward those teachers who perform or who do not? Where is the accountability and transparency in terms of your education spend? Because you can't just every year trumpet whatever the percentages of matriculants who pass that year, if the quality of the education isn't good, and if those tasked with teaching children also do not meet an adequate level, an adequate standard.
Exactly right. And of course, the other thing that government should definitely begin seriously looking into is that of school vouchers. That's where you basically provide each parent with the amount of money that would be in the form of a voucher that would normally be spent by the government on their student on their child to educate them, and then say, you can spend this where you want, at a public school, at a private school. That school then gets the resources from that voucher to educate your child, and the parents then have the ability to basically hold institutions to account, to pick the school that suits their kids best, and to actually create a little bit of a marketplace for education where we can hopefully get some better results. And until we start improving our country's education system, we are going to suffer enormous amounts of poverty and unrealized potential. So this is something that is a utter priority for government right now. Okay, let's move on to our next story. And that is that in consumer price inflation, basically the cost of the stuff that people need to buy, their groceries, and get by in their life, is up again. It's gone up to 5.4%, which is up from 4.8% in August. a couple of sort of key goods, things like cabbages and onions and such, are up more than, I think, a third from their cost last year, which is obviously pretty bad. The main contributors to the increase in inflation are food and non-alcoholic beverages, which are, of course, the main thing that people need in their lives. There's a lot of speculation, Chris, about, the Reserve Bank needs to lower interest rates in order to make sure that the economy can start growing again. But I don't know, that seems like unlikely to happen now that we've got inflation going back up again. It looked like it had peaked for a bit, but then it's, once again begun to rise. There's also not good news coming down the pipeline, as the wars in the Middle East that are heating up at the moment suggest that the price of oil might cause further inflation in the future. What do you make of all this?
Given the fuel price increases of the last 2 months, it comes as a little surprise that inflation is up now in September, especially given how reliant South Africa is on the import of oil and fuel. So when the international oil price increases, as it could now, given what's unfolding in Israel, the risk of that is quite substantial. That we'll see the trend line picking up for inflation to trend a little bit higher. That's a big jump from 4.8% to 5.4%. That's quite big month to month. So in that context, it makes you a bit concerned about the trends. On the point around the Reserve Bank and raising rates, this will likely pick up pace before the elections next year, or the Reserve Bank and cutting rates to stimulate growth. It's a good populist talking point. But as the governor of the Reserve Bank, Lesetja Kganyago, has at every opportunity highlighted, and I agree with the analysis, you can have the Reserve Bank being responsible in terms of monetary policy, but if the supply side drivers of inflation, like, for example, high fuel prices, operating costs for businesses, so when they have to mitigate for load shedding, for example, and they have to deal with high costs in terms of transport because they can't rely on rail, those costs then feed into their operations and in turn makes it more difficult for goods to move around the country and pushes inflation even higher. So the Reserve Bank in that context can cut rates as much as it wants. If the rest of government policy doesn't support that, then you don't get inflation trending lower. And you add to that, finally, a weaker rand that has weakened quite substantially over the last year against the dollar. Number one, because the dollar has been strengthened, but also, again, because of our own domestic policy choices. Investors leave government bonds, leave the rand. That makes the rand weaker. So when we import goods, it in turn is more expensive for South Africans. So all of those things sort of feed into high inflation remaining. I think the reality for the short to medium term, at least, the Reserve Bank, in its latest monetary policy review released on Tuesday this week, they released 2 per year. They see that they'll only reach the midpoint of their inflation target band, so between 3 to 6% by 2025. So that's quite a long way off still.
All right, let us move on to our next story, and this is about a report into the fire that destroyed Parliament. So it happened a while ago, in January of 2022, and it was clear already from the original reporting and investigations into the stuff that there had been a very, very big failure in the systems and administration of Parliament. One man is on trial at the moment, Zandile Mafe, although there's some questions as to his mental fitness to stand trial. That's still ongoing. But this report by Parliament has found that there are at least 5 officials who have been implicated for what it calls both system and human resources lapses that contributed to the fire. The probe found that the fire could have been prevented if Parliament precinct had been better secured, that a host of fire security measures such as doors and alarms were not functioning properly at the time, and these should have been able to contain or limit the damage that the fire did. Also, apparently, there was a decision made not to deploy parliamentary security staff at night, on weekends, and on public holidays, which I don't even know how anyone thought that's a good idea. What's the point of having security staff then anyway? Chris, this is one of those sort of more embarrassing episodes, I think, in our country's history of the last couple of years. When your legislature, the sort of heart of your democracy, catches fire and is no longer able to be used by your politicians, it's not a great sign for governance in the country. What do you make of all this?
No, it's a sort of phenomenon where even the basics go by the wayside. So again, you've got the grand plans of your developmental state, the state providing for everything for everyone, taking charge of things. But these basics of security, of governance, of protecting infrastructure just can't be enacted. I mean, it could have various drivers. You look at sort of just corruption and ineptitude as the biggest one, but also it filters down into just a lackadaisical attitude where regardless maybe of which party happens to be in national government, just the sort of the systems, the incentives aren't there. The sort of idea of taking ownership and responsibility for the seat that you occupy for the institution, maybe that culture hasn't really been inculcated sufficiently to ensure that this kind of thing doesn't really happen. When you've got everyone across the board, from the very top, from the president to someone who works as a cleaner, for example, buying in to that sense of ownership and this represents South African democracy, maybe you wouldn't see these sorts of things because everyone takes that responsibility for it. But that takes a long time to build up. And maybe at some point we can see that again if we can get some change going in national government. It's those small things that I think you take for granted that feed into bigger effects and consequences when they're not taken care of, and that have these negative effects down the line when they're not properly looked after.
Oh, that's exactly right. And I hope that our parliament is repaired and reopened soon. It is actually, the chamber itself is quite a nice building. And so it's it's a tragedy on many levels that this fire happened. But thankfully, of course, no one was hurt in it. But anyway, that's the time we have for today. We hope that you found it interesting. And we'll be back tomorrow. And all I can say is for today, that's a wrap.